So we're excited about today. I'm honored to be joining with Carol Johnson, my colleague, in moderating this session, focusing on employment and housing law. I am honored to introduce the chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Charlotte A. Burrows. And I just want to say that we value our relationship with EEOC headquarters in Washington, D.C., and IAOHRA board members have been serving on the advisory committee for state, local, and tribal programs. Many of our member agencies, in fact, are fair employment practices agencies. Charlotte A. Burrows was designated by President Biden as chair of the EEOC on January 20th, 2021. She was initially nominated to serve as a commissioner of the US EEOC in 2014 and then renominated in 2019. The US Senate unanimously confirmed her to a second term ending in 2023. Chair Burrows has advocated for strong civil rights protections and robust cooperation between the Commission, employers, and employees to advance equal opportunity in the workplace. She seeks to enhance the Commission's enforcement of all laws within its jurisdiction, focusing in particular on initiatives to combat harassment, to foster pay equity, and to advance diversity and inclusion. While at the Commission, she has worked to increase the agency's outreach to Native Americans, vulnerable immigrant and migrant communities, and other traditionally underserved populations. In addition, Chair Burrows is particularly interested in the impact of technology and big data on civil rights and employee privacy. Prior to her appointment to the EEOC, Chair Burrows served as Associate Deputy Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she worked on a broad range of civil and criminal matters, including employment litigation, voting rights, combating racial profiling, and implementing the Violence Against Women Act, among others. Chair Burrows previously served as General Counsel for Civil and Constitutional Rights to Senator Edward M. Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and later on the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. During her time on Capitol Hill, she worked on a variety of legislative initiatives, including the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009 and the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act of 2008. Before working on the Hill, Chair Burrows held several roles in the Civil Rights Division's Employment Litigation Section at DOJ, including Deputy Chief of the section. There, she represented the United States in all phases of civil litigation, including trial, to enforce Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as amended. Chair Burrows has agreed to stay throughout this session so that we can engage all of you at the end of the housing segment. And I will monitor the chat for your questions. Chair Burrows, welcome. It is a real treat to have you join us.
Good morning, and I am so pleased to be here. Thank you so much, Jean, for that really generous introduction. And I am thrilled to be able to join with all of you and with the distinguished members of the panel to discuss some of the really exciting work underway at the EEOC, or Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, as well as our vision for the future. The EEOC, as most of you know, was created in direct response to the historic 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And our mission is simple: to prevent and remedy discrimination in America's workplaces. That work is as important now and as necessary now as it was when we first opened our doors back in 1965. At the EEOC, we are enthusiastically and tirelessly committed to our mission. But we also know that this work is not EEOC's alone. All of us who work on employment matters have a critical role in ensuring that our basic values of fairness and equal justice are a reality at work. And that's why it's so important that we come together to strengthen our partnerships and exchange our very best ideas and vital information. So IAOHRA's mission and efforts to serve as a clearinghouse for this international exchange remain timely and deeply appreciated. In the more than half a century since the EEOC was founded, America has made real strides to advance equal opportunity. And we've honored our founding values by adopting federal civil rights laws, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and for that matter, of 1991, the Rehabilitation Act of 73, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 67, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, just to name a few. All of these laws were passed with broad bipartisan support in Congress, and they have helped make America a stronger, better, and fairer land. And on a global level, in the 1960s, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was one of the very first human rights treaties adopted by the United Nations. With currently 88 signatories and 182 parties, our world leaders have resolved to adopt all necessary measures for speedily eliminating racial discrimination in all of its forms and manifestations, and to build an international community free from all forms of racial segregation and racial discrimination. But these treaties and laws are not alone enough. When the US Senate began its historic debate back in 1964 about the Civil Rights Act that created the EEOC, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. predicted that when the legislation becomes law, its vitality and its power will depend as much on implementation as on the strength of its declarations. And together, we are that implementation. I'm inspired by this conference and excited to talk about what all of us, government agencies, civil rights advocates, and well-meaning employers, all of us can do to collectively advance justice and expand opportunity. The work of organizations like IAOHRA is essential to our collective efforts to achieve fair, inclusive employment practices that are a win-win for employers, workers, and the public. And I welcome this opportunity to engage with all of you as we explore innovative solutions to today's workplace challenges. Globally, this is an enormously important time for civil and human rights. The brutal and tragic murder of George Floyd in 2020 awakened the moral conscience, not just in the United States, but around the world. And the myriad civil rights challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, including its disproportionate impact on women, persons of color, immigrants, persons with disabilities, and so many other vulnerable populations, have really underscored the need to build diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplaces. So we have a lot on our plates at the EEOC, and I know you do as well. I want to acknowledge at the outset the importance of this time, and yes, the challenges for those of us who work on these issues related to employment, housing, civil and human rights. But that's why this year's theme of leading with infinite hope is so perfectly suited to the moment, because the challenges we face right now are also an opportunity for real and lasting change. Leading with hope requires optimism and vision and courage, and optimism that allows us to believe in a better tomorrow, knowing that it's always darkest before the dawn. The vision to imagine a better future, and the courage to follow that vision even when the path is not always clear. And it also takes the synergy of conferences and conversations like this one. And I'm delighted to have the chance to speak with all of you today. So in this moment of crafting a new human rights agenda, we have an amazing opportunity to collaborate as an international community to foster innovative problem solving and build more inclusive and fair workplaces. In that spirit, let me share some of our vision and how the EEOC is tackling problems today. So first, I want to start by sharing that we are working thoughtfully to strengthen and deepen our focus on addressing issues of systemic discrimination. This applies to systemic discrimination in all forms and on all bases, including but certainly not limited to race, as well as systemic harassment and our ongoing work to address Me Too issues. addressing systemic discrimination, and by that I mean broad, entrenched cultures of exclusion, harassment, and other discriminatory treatment, is absolutely critical to achieving long-term change. We, of course, must continue to address individual charges of discrimination, but addressing long-standing patterns of discrimination is essential to have the kind of significant impact we need. I'm thrilled to say that to support our efforts to combat systemic discrimination, we've been able at EEOC to hire more than 450 new employees across the agency since January of 2020 when I became chair. That was important because at the end of fiscal year 2020, our agency's full-time staffing was at its lowest point in 40 years, less than 2,000 employees compared to more than 3,300 back in 1980. So these new hires represent investments in the agency's capacity to support our work, but it's especially important as we look for systemic issues, because sometimes you really need the people power to dig deep to stay with those issues, as all of you know. The other matters I'd like to mention relates to areas where we see the potential to address systemic problems or advance approaches that may affect a broad range of employers and employees. So let me talk first about, as a really important example, our new initiative at EEOC to ensure that tech-based tools used in employment, such as artificial intelligence, are made to comply with federal civil rights laws. Many companies are using algorithmic tools like artificial intelligence or other types of machine learning throughout their human resources processes. And as many of you know, by some estimates, as many as 83% of employers, and amongst our largest employers, some of those Fortune 500 employers in the United States, it's up to 90% of those employers using some form of automated tools to screen or rank candidates for hire. And despite the aura of neutrality and objectivity around some of these tools, AI and other predictive tools can reduce human biases, or reproduce rather human biases, and also sometimes introduce new forms of bias. Algorithmic tools have great potential, of course, to streamline employment processes and perhaps even to support workplace diversity efforts with the proper safeguards. However, the tools could also be used if we're not vigilant and monitor them carefully. They could also be used to mask or even perpetuate existing discrimination and create new discriminatory barriers to jobs. So let me tell you more specifically what I mean. In some instances, these tools may be designed, even if inadvertently, to seek candidates who share the same characteristics as high-performing current employees. But if the current workforce itself is not diverse or otherwise does not reflect the full range of qualified talents in the industry, this method may actually reproduce or even exacerbate a lack of diversity. In some industries, AI is also being used to create new forms of electronic surveillance of employees at work. The goal is apparently to maximize efficiency by ensuring that workers adhere to carefully calculated minimum times in performing their tasks. But these strict efficiency goals may result in a lack of accommodations and other violations against workers who may need accommodations due to pregnancy or disability. The initiative will build on the past work that the Commission has done in the area by looking at big data and algorithmic tools. And that really dates back to 2016. So we're taking a closer look now at how technology continues to fundamentally change how some employment decisions are being made. And the new initiative will allow us to look at the overarching goal of helping to guide applicants, employees, employers, and technology vendors in ensuring that these new tech tools are used consistently with our national civil rights laws. And we want to allow employees and employees to benefit from these technologies while also ensuring that they don't inadvertently become a high-tech pathway to discrimination. So you'll be hearing a lot more from us about that. We're very excited to be looking at those issues. Like AI, The COVID-19 pandemic is presenting us with a lot of new challenges, including in the area of civil rights. The Commission is very focused, as I know you all are as well, on addressing the numerous employment and civil rights issues arising in connection with the pandemic. COVID-19 has proven to be, frankly, not just a healthcare crisis and an economic crisis, but also a civil rights crisis. The pandemic and its economic fallout have disproportionately impacted people of color, women, older workers, individuals with disabilities, and other vulnerable workers. That has serious implications in the workplace and requires a systematic and thoughtful response. During the pandemic, about 23% of American workers began working remotely. And while that's certainly not the majority of the workforce, it's still an enormous change from the pre-pandemic status quo. And the process of transitioning to remote work was a major undertaking. And the latest concern on many of our minds, and yours as well, I'm sure, is what returning to the workplace will look like. With increasing vaccinations and other necessary public health mitigation strategies, returning to the physical workplace is becoming a true possibility for those who have been able to work virtually during the pandemic. And as employers, including at the EEOC, are beginning to navigate returning to the physical office, our agency is focused on providing employers with tools to assist in addressing civil rights issues as they arise. As many of you know, the EEOC has issued extensive technical assistance on COVID-19 on a plethora of issues throughout this pandemic. It's been in the form of an online what you should know document. If you have not checked it out, I commend it to you. That document has dozens of Q&As divided by topic for easy reference. And we have been updating it periodically throughout the pandemic. We anticipate doing that in the coming weeks as well. So if you have checked it out, it's still worth going back and taking another look. And we've in particular gotten a lot of questions and therefore added to our guidance information about dealing with religious objections to COVID-19 vaccine and requests for accommodations because of religion, as well as medical and disability accommodations in a host of other areas. Most recently, in mid-November, we issued more guidance that explains and clarifies the protections available to employees, former employees, and job applicants who believe that they suffered retaliation for engaging in protected activities under the ADA, Title VII, or other federal employment discrimination laws. And the update really discusses how those rights are balanced against an employer's need to enforce COVID-19 health and safety protocols. And diversity is another issue that I'm really excited to talk about, and I hope we will be able to touch on during the question and answer period. While increasing our focus on systemic issues, AI and COVID-19 are critically important, we've also been focused on this vital question of how to foster diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in employment. In the past few years, we've really witnessed attempts to reckon with the historic inequities facing racial and ethnic minorities. A reckoning in the United States that was spurred in part by the horrific police violence that was widely reported with respect to communities of color. And at the same time, we've also seen in the United States a rise in harassment and violence directed at Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. All of this affects workplaces to some degree and has put a spotlight on broader issues of economic inequality and systemic discrimination. And many companies have issued public statements of commitment to racial justice and have continued to seek ways to reflect that commitment in their corporate practices. The EEOC can help employers address systemic discrimination in their workplaces and proactively promote diversity. And when I speak of diversity, I mean on a broad definition thereof that includes all the different protected classes that our laws at EEOC cover. So we know that to be successful at creating an inclusive workplace, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility must truly be woven into the fabric of the organization through training and anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policies. The Biden administration has taken a real whole of government approach to these issues. And the EEOC, together with our federal agency partners like OFCCP and the Justice Department really has a unique opportunity to help employers eliminate systemic discrimination and proactively promote diversity and a more inclusive workplace. In addition, we're supporting the federal government's own diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility efforts by providing executive branch agencies with technical assistance in this area. So you'll also be hearing more from us on these specific issues in the coming weeks and months. And finally, I'd like to highlight a joint effort between the EEOC and the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, in the Department of Labor, rather, to focus on retaliation. This is really a key pillar to ensure fairness in the workplace and to combat retaliation, which remains the most frequent form of discrimination filed with the EEOC. And so we're, just to put it in context for you, we're looking at, in fiscal year 2020 alone, nearly 56% of all private sector and state and local government charges filed with the Commission have alleged some form of retaliation. And applicants and employees in all industries are subjected to retaliation, but many don't report unlawful discrimination or harassment out of fear of losing their jobs and thereby suffering adverse consequences in the workplace. And that has only become more severe, if you will, that fear of retaliation in this pandemic economy. And so the fear of retaliation has been and remains the leading reason why people stay silent instead of voicing their concerns about bias and discrimination. And for that reason, combating retaliation in many ways, if you think about it, is really a linchpin for all of our other work. Unless employees are protected from retaliation for asserting their civil rights, those rights will exist only on paper. So I'm pleased that in November, we were able to launch really what's been a joint initiative that will be continuing well into next year with the US Department of Labor and the National Labor Relations Board to raise awareness about and really help combat the persistent and urgent problem of workplace retaliation. We held back on November 17th, the first of several virtual discussions that will focus on the importance of anti-retaliation protections for those exercising their rights, as well as the agency's shared commitment to ensuring that employers have effective strategies for taking immediate action to stop retaliation. The first panel was intended for the employer community, with subsequent dialogues planned with a host of other stakeholders, including labor organizations and civil rights groups in the coming months. Another issue of importance for the EEOC is the need to move forward in realizing the full promise of the Supreme Court's decision in the Bostock v. Clayton County case. That resolved the question of whether Title VII actually covers discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity with a resounding yes. So we are working full bore to implement the promise of that decision in all of its aspects. And in January, the Commission published its first decision applying Bostock in a case called Bart M. v. the Department of the Interior. So it was one of our federal sector decisions. It was unanimous and it was bipartisan. And the agency has already issued several additional federal sector decisions in cases alleging discrimination against LGBTQI employees. We also recently released new resources on our website. So if you haven't seen those, I commend those to you as well, to help the public understand both the Bostock opinion and our own established decisions in this area at the EEOC. So we'll be working very hard to help implement the executive order issued by President Biden on his first day in office, Executive Order 13988, preventing and combating discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. This action is key to the implementation of the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock, and we are working hard with our other agencies to think through how to really make its promise a reality. I would say before I close, I want to talk just a moment about pay equity, because that has been a perennial problem in employment with our enforcement agencies have really sort of seen that. And it's such an important area of focus. And it remains such a persistent problem that really deserves innovative solutions. It's been about 60 years, not quite, almost 60 years since President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act of 1963. And nearly as long since the 1964 Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination in pay and promotions, as well as a whole host of other issues based on race, sex, color, national origin, and religion. And yet, while we have seen progress, significant and unjustified pay disparities still exist on all of those bases. And unfortunately, the pandemic has really deepened existing inequalities and has only made the problem more urgent. Today, the gender pay gap stands at 82 cents to the dollar, and it's even more significant for women of color. We know that not all of these gaps are due to direct pay discrimination, but it's apparent from the academic literature, the research, and from EEOC's own work that discriminatory factors like race and gender segregation in jobs and assignments, discrimination in promotions, and traditional pay discrimination really have contributed to the problem. At the EEOC, we still see cases of blatant pay discrimination. As just one example, back in September of this year, EEOC settled a pay discrimination suit on behalf of a female IT analyst who was paid $17,000 less than her male counterpart. Now, our investigation found that the female analyst had 24 years of experience. She performed the same tasks, assignments, and work as her male coworker, who was hired at the same time from the same former employer. But because most employees don't know what their colleagues are paid and often don't know to file a charge if they are shortchanged, finding cases like this can be like looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack. And to help change that and assist in better focusing our responses and our resources, last year, EEOC completed its first historic collection of pay data from private employers with 100 or more employees. We've also contracted with the National Academies of Sciences to make recommendations regarding how the EEOC can best use this pay data and perhaps future data collections to combat pay discrimination and focus our enforcement and our outreach efforts. And it will inform how we collect pay data in the future. As most of you know, many states are already racing ahead in this area with new laws. Some of you know that very well because perhaps you're helping to enforce them. And in some instances, new pay data reporting requirements are included in those laws. So I suspect that's been in part because there's not been more movement at the federal level. And my hope is that the commission will be able to develop a really thoughtful, careful approach in this area with stakeholder input that will allow for a consistent national approach as well. In the meantime, the EEOC will continue to use all of the tools in our toolbox to promote pay equity and to close those unjustified pay gaps, particularly the ones that we see the most, which are in the areas of gender and racial pay gaps. So I know today our time is very limited and I'd like the chance to hear from all of you and from colleagues on the panel. So although there are so many other issues that are front and center at the EEOC, I will end as I began and just say very briefly, despite the uncertainty of these times, I know that together we have expertise and the resources to meet this moment and craft a new human rights agenda, one that reflects renewed optimism and our best course of action based on international change of ideas. And of course, that infinite hope that is part of the theme for today's meeting. And as chair of the EEOC, I stand with you in leading with infinite hope. And please know that our agency is tirelessly committed to ensuring inclusive workplaces for all, a commitment that we share with IAOHRA and all of its member organizations. So thank you very much. And I appreciate it and look forward to hearing from all of you.
Thank you so much, Chair Burrows, for the timely and compelling issues that you've highlighted. And I want to turn this over now to my colleague, Carol Johnson, but I know there will be some intersection on these issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I just want to also thank you, Chair Burrows. These are very, very important issues, and I really share the thought and gratitude for your leadership on these issues. Good morning, civil rights practitioners and warriors. I am so grateful to be here today with you. I'm honored to be a part of IAOHRA. I serve as the Director of Civil Rights for the City of Austin, and came on board actually this year as the first Civil Rights Officer for the City of Austin. I also serve as second Vice President for IAOHRA. So thank you all for your tireless work in human and civil rights, and thank you for continuing to help us overcome these issues. I think we can all agree that we are all here at a time for a time such as this. So thank you all for your work. I have the honor of introducing our next speaker to our panel, Demetria McCain, who serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Demetria McCain assists HUD's efforts to eliminate housing discrimination, promote economic opportunity, and achieve diverse, inclusive communities. She joins HUD following 15 years of service as Vice President of at the Inclusive Communities Project, a Dallas-based affordable housing nonprofit. And prior to becoming president, she oversaw operations, communications, and ICP's Mobility Assistance Program, which is a housing mobility program that helps housing choice voucher holders exercise their fair housing rights. And we know this is extremely, extremely important work. She also conceived while there Voices for Opportunity, an initiative that has provided advocacy training to low-income renters and neighborhood groups of color. Before joining ICP, she worked on USDA's Section 515, rural multifamily housing matters at the National Housing Law. She also was a staff attorney for Neighborhood Legal Services Program of Washington, D.C., assigned to the Southeast office, where her portfolio primarily included landlord-tenant matters for low-income renters in private and public housing. She has taught as an adjunct instructor a fair housing and homelessness course to undergraduate Coppin State University students, and brings dual vantage points to FHEO after having spent years assisting both housing choice voucher holders who sought low poverty, well-resourced housing options, and neighborhood groups in underserved communities of color who sought more equitable distribution of resources and services. She has sat on several local and national nonprofit boards and is a sought-after panelist and commentator on affordable fair housing and the impacts of residential segregation. Please help us welcome Demetria McCain. Thank you so much. I think you are muted.
Okay. Hi, this is Javier. I'm the Zoom Tech. If you click on the microphone, because your microphone is enabled, but we cannot hear you. If you click next to the microphone, there's an arrow that goes up. And if you check your audio settings, and there you should see test your speaker, test your mic. And if you see if your speaker and your mic is on. Now you're muted. Now you're not, but we still cannot hear you. I don't know if you see when you check your microphone, if you see the the input length levels going up and down. That's a sign that your microphone is on. Okay.
Is she
So-
doing a remote access? If she's doing a remote access, if say for instance, if she's logged in at home to her computer at work, then the microphone is going to be connected to that computer per se at work and not off of the laptop at home. So she might have to just use the laptop at home and disconnect from the server at work, because sometimes that will mess up the mic as well.
that HUD systems work a little differently than the average person when it comes to Zoom. So I'm glad you can hear me. Thank you so much for your patience. Okay, if I could, if you would indulge me, I just want to say thank you to Ms. Johnson again for that introduction. Thank you, IAOHRA, for convening the forum. And I am just thrilled to join Chair Barrows and Ms. Rice on this panel to represent the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and my own office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, where our mandate is to eliminate housing discrimination, promote economic opportunity, and achieve diverse, inclusive communities. Now, I know that many of you, even while your own families face incredibly difficult challenges over the last year and a half, have put a lot of energy and effort into serving residents who face challenges to their civil rights and their human rights. And you've adapted to this new world, and you continue to do so every single day. And some of you, that even includes some of our TIP and SAP partners in the audience who do this work day in, day out to enforce the Fair Housing Act. So I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you for all the work you do every day. I also just wanted to make sure that we remember why we do this work, why we do the work of fair housing. When the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, remember, that was just 1 week, 7 days after Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, a piece of legislation that he was working on really hard to pass. And Senators Brooke and Senator Mondale, the Act's authors, understood that where we live impacts nearly every single part of our lives, from our schools, where our children can attend, to the jobs we can find, to matters that impact residents' health. And Senator Brooke was very keen on making that very clear. But now for too long and for just too often, the color of a person's skin or a person's gender identity or disability status has really kind of dictated where and how people live. And therefore, it is limited access to schools, to jobs, to healthcare, to clean air. So for too long, people of color have faced discrimination in our housing market. And when they're trying to rent homes, they face discrimination. When they're trying to secure mortgages, they face discrimination. When they're even trying to get their homes appraised, they face discrimination. Today, the home ownership gap between Black and white families has reached levels higher than they were in 1968, before the Fair Housing Act was passed, when banks could still legally discriminate against borrowers based on the color of their skin. For too long and in too many places, people of color have lived in the least desirable areas, near hazards like landfills and toxic waste facilities, in areas with flood zones that leave residents exposed to extreme weather. And actually, Latinx residents are roughly 50% more likely to live in communities threatened by coastal flooding that is exacerbated by today's climate change. And for too long, for very too long, very so much too long, residents with disabilities have not been able to find safe and accessible homes. So we must remedy the actual structures and policies that perpetuate the inequities in our nation. Many of them, such as practices of redlining, were created by our very own government. And that is why the Department of Housing and Urban Development is taking action to realize the full promise of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, a promise that directs HUD to affirmatively further fair housing, which means to proactively break down barriers that unjustly block people from moving into neighborhoods of their own choosing. And as HUD is directed to affirmatively further fair housing, we as a department, we must ensure that HUD grantees do the same. Now, earlier this year, HUD published an interim final rule regarding affirmatively furthering fair housing, which we refer to as AFFH. Now, that restored the statutory definitions of AFFH and the certifications that had been removed from the 2015 rule during the prior administration. HUD's next rulemaking intends to build upon and further improve the 2015 rule by instituting a comprehensive fair housing planning process and goal-setting framework that actually increases efficiency and improves outcomes for HUD's end users. Let's remember that. Let's always remember the end users. End users being who? Residents and communities. So in our process to improve the rule, we've gathered input from a wide range of sources, maybe some of you, because that's included civil rights organizations, elected officials, federal agencies, housing providers, policymakers, and members of the public. And once this process is complete, we plan to issue a final rule that responds to the very valuable advice that we've gotten from the public. Because as Secretary Sledge would say, we want to hear from you. But beyond AFFH, there's much more on our plate. Bostock was mentioned earlier. In January 2021, President Biden issued an executive order extending federal laws that prohibit sex discrimination to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, HUD, in turn, issued a memorandum to our FIPS and our FAP partners and to FHEO, stating that the Bostock Supreme Court decision extends to the Fair Housing Act's prohibition on discrimination because of sex. We heard about it spoken earlier in the employment context. It also relates to the housing context. This means that when a housing provider refuses to sell, rent, or otherwise make unavailable housing based in part on a person's sexual orientation or gender identity, the housing provider potentially violates the Fair Housing Act. And on February 11th, HUD directed our fair housing partners to review complaints of discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity that they had received since January 20th, 2020. Since this public clarification, our office has processed, listen to this, we have processed nearly twice as many cases alleging sex discrimination due to gender identity and sexual orientation than were processed during the same period previously. And as the president said in his executive order, every person should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear, no matter who they are or whom they love. Now, other exciting work we're doing to live out the full promise of the Fair Housing Act, we're doing that through PAVE, which is an interagency task force to help end bias and racism in the appraisal market. Now, PAVE, P-A-V-E, stands for Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity. The value of a person's home and the rate at which it grows should never be determined by the color of a person's skin. Yet studies have found that homes in largely white neighborhoods are appraised at values that are nearly 25% higher than similar homes in largely Black neighborhoods. Now, this task force, this this multi-departmental task force, co-chaired by Secretary Marsha Fudge, brings together partners from across the federal government. And it is the very first such effort in the history of our country. And another step to help eliminate the homeownership gap. Just this week, HUD released a legal memo that makes clear that some special purpose credit programs that are lawful under the Equal Credit and Opportunity Act, known as ECOA, and other federal laws, generally are not barred by the Fair Housing Act. Now, this guidance was met with enthusiasm from heads of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Mortgage Bankers Association, and my fellow panelist, Lisa Rice's organization, NAFA, and others. Now, let me just explain. The import is that special purpose credit programs are designed to assist those who have historically been locked out of home ownership opportunities, such as economically disadvantaged classes of persons and first-time home buyers whose parents and grandparents may have been excluded from the housing and credit markets because of discriminatory practices. Now, let me just say, the opportunities that these types of programs can unlock can be transformative in the lives of so very many people and ultimately in our communities. Now, in addition to these critical historic steps, we are continuously, vigorously enforcing the Fair Housing Act and other civil rights laws to combat discrimination in housing, home mortgage lending, and appraisals. And on November 30th, just the other day, through funding from the American Rescue Plan, HUD awarded a total of $71 million to partners in the Fair Housing Initiatives Program, or FIPS as we call it, to use the money to enhance the department's efforts to help those who help us fight discrimination in the housing market, particularly that discrimination that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. On January 20th of this year, going back to January, President Biden also issued another executive order entitled Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities through the Federal Government. The administration also issued a memo to HUD Secretary about the need to redress our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies. Now, we at HUD are doing everything we can to put our country on a path that finally provides every American with equality, opportunity, and equity, regardless of the color of their skin, their disability status, their country of origin, their gender, or the zip code where they were born. Now, because I would like to be invited back sometime, I'm going to stop there, and I'll leave you with this. As Secretary Fudge would say, it's a new day at HUD. Thank you so much for your time, for having me, and most importantly, thank you for the work you're doing in support of human rights. Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
Now I am muted. Thank you so much, Deputy Assistant Secretary, for your leadership, for all the work that you've been doing. I think we're all really excited to see the new direction with the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing mandates that have come down, and also obviously with the new rule that came out or the opinion that came out this week. So thank you for that. Thank you for all the work that you're doing, that you're continuing to do, that you will do in the future. And at this time, I would like to introduce our next panelist and our final panelist on for this morning, who all of you know has done extraordinary work in the areas of housing, fair housing, equity. Lisa Rice, who is president and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance. In her capacity as president of the National Fair Housing Alliance, Ms. Rice oversees the resource development, public policy, communication, and enforcement divisions of the agency. NAFA works with over 200 member agencies across the country to eliminate barriers in the housing markets and to expand equal opportunity in lending opportunities. NAFA provides a range of services to affirmatively further fair housing, including community development, neighborhood stabilization, training, education, outreach, advocacy, consulting, and enforcement, and the list, of course, goes on. Ms. Rice's fair housing and fair lending work began at the local level. Prior to joining NAFA, she was president and CEO of the Fair Housing Center of Toledo, Ohio, and the Northwest Ohio Development Agency, where she created the state's only anti-predatory lending remediation program. She serves on the state of Ohio's Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board, the State Farm Bank Consumer Advisory Council, and Federal Reserve's Board's Consumer Advocacy Council. She is a current member of the JP Morgan Chase Consumer Advisory Council, Mortgage Bankers Association's Consumer Advisory Council, Freddie Mac's Affordable Housing Advisory Council, and America's Homeowner Alliance Advisory Board. Please help me welcome our friend and colleague, Lisa Rice.
Carol, thank you so very much. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's so wonderful to be back with you. Your trainings are so important for developing and building the fair housing field. And so it's always my pleasure to be able to join you. I have to thank my dear, dear friend and hometown colleague, Jim Stowe, not only for his partnership down through the years, but also for his friendship and support. And Carol, also, I've got to thank you and the other members of IAOHRA for inviting me to be with you. Our human rights commissions and offices are critical partners in helping to enforce the nation's fair housing laws and educating consumers and industry players and of course, other stakeholders about fair housing best practices. So I'm really honored to be here and humbled to be on this panel with the great Demetria McCain, one of my dear colleagues who has played such a critical role in advancing fair housing opportunities and civil rights in this country, and of course, played such a leadership role in achieving the Supreme Court victory in the Inclusive Communities case that preserved disparate impact, which is such a critical civil rights tool. And I'm also honored and humbled to be on this panel with Chair Burrows of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, who is leading the way in our nation in ensuring that discrimination is eliminated in the places where we work. So my job is to provide just a few updates about fair housing trends. And I am glad, last time I was with you all, I didn't have such great news. But I am glad to report that we have some really, really great news. And if you'll just give me a moment to share my screen, let me see if I can make this work, because I am sometimes technologically challenged. We'll see what I can do here. And are you all seeing the PowerPoint slide? I hope you're seeing the full slide.
Yes, yes, we can see it.
I hope what you're, let's see. Are you guys seeing a full screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I did it right. Okay, so great news to report, and I have to start out with the Build Back Better bill. This is a bill that the National Fair Housing Alliance and our colleagues in the fair housing field have worked so hard to not only help draft and write, but also to get across the finish line. We're not quite there yet. We're almost there. But this bill is so critically important because it contains the single largest investment in fair housing in our nation's history. The bill did pass the House back in November. It is expected, according to President Biden, to pass the Senate before the end of the year. It contains significant support for the full panoply, the full infrastructure of organizations who are working on fair housing issues. We did not get the full support, the full amount of funding that we were seeking for the bill, but it's still significant funding. And again, as I said, it's the single largest investment in fair housing in the nation's history. So there's $100 million for the FAP program. $75 million of that will go to support state and local agencies who are enforcing state and local fair housing laws. That support is to help state and local agencies affirmatively further fair housing. So to work with HUD and fair housing organizations as a really critical partner in fulfilling the AFFH provision of the Fair Housing Act. That $75 million is also to help expand and strengthen the capacity of substantially equivalent agencies to administer and enforce fair housing laws. And we're also hoping that a part of that funding can be used to help build the capacity of state and local organizations who are not yet substantially equivalent, but to help those organizations to become substantially equivalent so we can add more robust and viable partners in the fight for fair housing. $25 million of that is for HUD administration, which is something that we view as critically important. And you'll see that theme reiterated as I talk about the Build Back Better bill. For so many years, HUD has been defunded. HUD has had to go without staffing, without technology upgrades, and that really hampers our ability to effectively enforce the law when HUD doesn't have the resources that it needs. Additionally, we were able to get $540 million for the Fair Housing Initiatives Program. This is funding to help strengthen the capacity and ability of private fair housing organizations. These are fair housing enforcement organizations whose major goal is to enforce the Fair Housing Act. And it is to enable those fair housing organizations to address inquiries and complaints, enable them to engage in activities to affirmatively further fair housing, conduct regional, national, and local investigations, engage in education and outreach activities, and then to also address the increased cost of delivering services to meet increased housing market activity and to address evolving business practices which increase the cost of conducting an investigation, as you all know. And then $160 million is carved out for HUD administration of that program. The Build Back Better provision, the Build Back Better bill contains many, many housing provisions, many of them. I cannot possibly go through all of them in the small amount of time that we have here together, because we want to make sure we get to questions and answers. But I do want to talk about a couple of really critical provisions in the bill that the fair housing and civil rights community provided leadership on. We helped to craft and draft these sections of the bill, and we view them as important equity provisions. So one of them is the Community Restoration and Revitalization Fund. This is $2 billion to help support community-led projects. So empowering communities, empowering people on the ground to create equitable infrastructure that they need in their neighborhoods. It's funding to help create, preserve, and improve affordable and accessible housing. It's also funding to help create and expand and even maintain community land trusts and shared equity housing programs, and to make sure that those programs comport with our nation's fair housing laws. There's additional funding there. You'll see for HUD to provide technical assistance. This is so critically important. Technical assistance to those community stakeholders who are going to be implementing these programs. And we see this as, of course, we see our human rights commissions as critical partners in helping to implement this work, and also to help provide technical assistance to these community organizations so that they understand what the local and regional fair housing laws say in the jurisdictions where these programs will be implemented. The biggest, I wouldn't say the biggest coup, let me take that back. One of the things that we are most proud of is the first generation down payment assistance program. You heard Demetria kind of allude to this in her comments. So we didn't get the full funding that we wanted for the program, but we do have $10 billion broken down, as you see there. About $7 billion will be going to states, your state housing finance agencies, who are, again, can be very critical partners in the fight for fair housing. One of the things that we were able to get included in the bill is a requirement that every entity, including state housing finance agencies who receive this funding, have to have an affirmatively furthering fair housing action plan. This is the first in our nation's history. And of course, your state housing finance agencies are going to be looking to all of you to be partners with them to help them develop and build effective, meaningful, affirmatively furthering fair housing plans. A little over $2 billion is going to be for competitive grants for this first generation down payment program. We hired Urban Institute to engage in a lot of research for us, because what we heard from Republican members of Congress was that they did not want to see any race-conscious solutions in the Build Back Better bill. And so what we did was we essentially conducted research to identify race-neutral characteristics that get us hyper-targeting for underserved communities, communities of color, people with disabilities, people who are limited English proficient. And we landed on first generation. And if you think about it, intuitively, it makes sense. Most people of color in the United States are not homeowners. And most people of color in the United States have parents who were not homeowners because of the legacy of discrimination that you heard Demetria and Chair Burrows talk about previously. So that legacy of discrimination, much of it federal backed discrimination, precluded people in communities of color from being able to access homeownership opportunities. That's why there's such a huge homeownership gap in the United States. So focusing on first generation home buyers lets us target in on those consumers and communities of color that historically have been isolated from these opportunities. And then the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, it's a tax credit provision. I think you all will appreciate this. In many communities of color where we have appraisal bias issues and redlining and other forms of disinvestment, the value of those properties have been deflated. And I know Dr. Perry talked about this yesterday. The challenge that creates is if you want to build housing in these historically disinvested areas, or if you want to purchase a home and renovate that house, there's a huge gap. There's a gap between how much it costs to renovate the house and how much the house will then be worth on the fair market. And so the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act provides a tax credit that makes up and fills that gap so that we can build and develop more affordable housing. Let me just touch on a few emerging issues in the fair housing space. Appraisal bias is huge. And if you've been watching the news, you'll know that one of our fair housing organizations, the Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California, just worked with a family, the Austin Tate family in Marin City in Northern California, to file a lawsuit against an appraisal and an appraiser and appraisal management firm when their home, this is an African-American couple who owned a home in a predominantly Black community, their home was devalued by roughly $500,000 in an allegedly discriminatory appraisal. That case was just filed the other day, but appraisal bias is a huge issue. And this is an area where the cost of investigation is extremely high. And so that's why the Build Back Better bill will be so critically important to provide the funding to address these kinds of systemic issues. We are still seeing challenges with real estate steering. And then we're seeing a lot of challenges related to the COVID pandemic, as is fallout from the pandemic, increased bias and discrimination, hate acts that are occurring at a person's home, which then it invokes the Fair Housing Act, right, and fair housing laws. So these hate crimes against people with disabilities, hate crimes against Asian Americans. We're also seeing increased problems with the way that foreclosure forbearance and loan modification provisions are being implemented, some in a discriminatory fashion that could violate the law. We're also seeing challenges with evictions, again, in a way that could be violative of the law. And then the last thing that I'll mention is tech and algorithmic bias, which is a major challenge. More technologies, and you heard Chair Burrows talk about this. Technology is just exploding, especially during this pandemic. The use of technology has grown exponentially. And the technologies, I'll just put it out there. I have never seen a technology in the housing and lending space that did not have embedded bias. So that includes credit scoring systems, automated underwriting systems, risk-based pricing systems, tenant screening selection systems, digital marketing platforms. Many of you heard about our groundbreaking settlement with Facebook, where we challenged their discriminatory advertising platform. So this is a growing area. It's a burgeoning area. It also is an area that is extremely expensive to investigate and adjudicate. Again, why we need those funds in the Build Back Better bill. And then the final thing that I have to say, because it is, I mean, such a major coup, as Demetria shared. I must thank Demetria for her leadership. I must thank Secretary Fudge, must thank Elena McCargo at HUD. Y'all, I'm literally holding back the tears. Because special purpose credit programs, they're a provision of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. This provision was put in the law when the law was passed in 1976. It's been on the books that long. And we have not utilized this critical racial equity tool. One of the major reasons we have not utilized this tool to expand fair credit access for underserved groups is because lenders said they couldn't do it because they were afraid they would get sued for violating the Fair Housing Act, because special purpose credit programs, and I put some examples there, they actually allow lenders to create a special mortgage program for different classes of people who share a common characteristic, like residents of color residing in disinvested census tracts, or residents of majority Black census tracts, or residents living on tribal lands, Do you see that language there? That is race conscious language. Special purpose credit programs allow lenders, and in some cases, nonprofit organizations like CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, to implement race conscious mortgage credit programs to overcome the legacy of discrimination and the structural inequities that exist in our society. And so HUD, in this groundbreaking guidance, affirmed that special purpose credit programs do not violate the Fair Housing Act. And this was so important for them to do this. I just cannot thank HUD enough and express my gratitude enough for what HUD has done. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I hope that that works and puts us back. And I'm going to stop there so that we have time for Q&A.
Thank you so much for highlighting all those areas. And that bill is going to be, I mean, that the provisions, I mean, it's extraordinary. All of the things that we're doing, I mean, it's pretty exciting. I mean, we're coming out of you know, all the issues that we've been dealing with for the past couple of years, the you know, the social justice, the civil unrest, the pandemic, and all the problems. And I feel like, you know, still we're rising, you know. So it's very exciting. It's a very exciting place for us to be at this time. So thank you for that. And I guess at this time we're going to open it up for questions. We do have some time. And we're open for questions.
Hi, my name is IAOHRA, and I'm with the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. And a lot of what Lisa has spoke about is a lot of what I have experienced personally when it comes to buying a home early, going through different type of lending issues with the lenders that provided me my home purchase, and the challenges that I went through to be able to maintain that, along with that property, along with being put in or forced into modifications, or being told that I will be in place in foreclosure unless I submitted a certain amount of money. Along with that, just giving up and selling my property, and still not being able to get answers on why I had to sell my property, having to do things such as filing bankruptcy and ruining the credit and things like that, when you know for sure that you're doing things properly and following all the procedures. To also add to that, to be a small business owner and still have to go through those same things, such as the credit check, such as being once you do things with these properties that you are renting or, you know, leasing, you're being forced out or being left with all of your money just in that business in which you was hoping to be able to see grow and start a legacy for your own family. So I would like to personally possibly speak with Lisa or someone in the office that would be able to help me see some closure in it, because I'm still wrestling with these things that I've experienced as early as 29 years old. So this has been going on for like 33 years now. And just a year ago, I was going through the same thing with the business part of my personal development as an African American in the United States. So if I could possibly speak to someone within your office, Lisa, with regards to chapters or steps I need to make, because I still believe that I'm in the cycle of being able to fight these companies with what they did, as far as, you know, forcing me to be able to sell my property, also just dealing with trying to hold on to my own business currently that I have. So definitely, if you could forward some information to me, or I can put in the chat box my email address, and I'll be able to communicate with do from there. Thank you.
Yes, I'll do that, Levon. I'll put it in the chat.
I believe Diane Clemens Board has a question.
Thank you. My question is in regards to the special purpose credit program. How do you envision that these programs will be implemented in communities? And are there opportunities for FAPs to work with banks, or just what exactly will that look like? What will the infrastructure be on those programs?
Sure, I can take a stab at that and then turn it over to Demetria. I didn't see who asked the question, but there are already financial institutions that have implemented special purpose credit programs, just a few. And literally yesterday, when HUD made the announcements, issued the guidance, our network has received multiple calls from lenders who have said, this is what we're waiting for. We are now ready to launch our special purpose credit programs. And so we're getting inundated with calls. In fact, the Mortgage Bankers Association just reached out to me just a few minutes ago and said, we're ready to go. Our members are ready to go. So the National Fair Housing Alliance is working on the development of a special purpose credit toolkit for lenders and for other stakeholders like human rights commissions. So you can have this in order to work with lenders in your community and also your state housing finance agency, because state housing finance agencies can now launch special purpose credit programs. So you can work with your states to help them develop a special purpose credit program, and you can provide that fair housing expertise that they will need to ensure that these programs do not violate the law. So, and I'll turn it over to Demetria.
All right, so can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Great,
Yeah.
Still on this phone here. So Diane, let me just tell you that this came out this week, as was mentioned by myself and Lisa. And what it was our general counsel's office wrote the opinion, and I can put the link in the chat for everyone, making sure everyone knew this would not be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. And the Secretary Fudge, actually wrote a letter to her peers through like OCC, FHFA, as well as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, actually inviting them for us to all come together and get together. And so I think that story is being written as we speak. So you're right here at the beginning of it. We are not the regulators, so to say, but we did have a critical part in making sure that the world understood that this wouldn't be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. So I think we should look to the joining of all of these agencies coming together to see how this plays out. So I think just follow the story, and we'll have probably a better answer in the coming days to that. And I'll put the link in the chat.
If I may ask a question of Chair Burrows, and I was fascinated that both in the employment context and in the housing context that artificial intelligence is a burgeoning area. I know that in Alexandria, Virginia, my Human Rights Commission has been focused for about a year on artificial intelligence with respect to predictive policing and court issues. And we had an expert from Georgetown come and to train us. And in fact, she's been featured on 60 Minutes. But it really had escaped me that we may be missing an opportunity here in investigating, and I'll specify for Chair Burrows, employment cases, because if we're talking about any aspect of discrimination that's occurring in the workplace, from failure to hire to promotions, all of that, how can we look more deeply and try to find out if some of these algorithmic programs have been at play in leading to the discrimination. Do you expect that the EEOC will be issuing kind of a toolkit for us so that we can help guide our investigators to look more deeply?
That is a phenomenal question. Thank you for flagging that. That is, at the core, one of the things that makes this kind of tricky, because not only, it's not surprising that it's not front and center necessarily in terms of the work that everyone is doing, because this has been rapidly evolving, right? The sort of use of these programs, even just since we first started looking at it in 2016, has really exploded. So yes, we do intend to, part of the reason for the initiative is to educate everyone about what's going on. And in some ways that includes the employers. Remember, a lot of times the employers do not themselves develop these programs. They purchase them and these tools rather, and in part to get the benefit of efficiencies and in some instances in the hope that they will increase fairness, actually. And in some cases, I suppose that's possible, but where we really have to be vigilant is identifying the ways that they're being used in different areas. And so absolutely, we want to be a resource for the fair employment practice agencies so that we can together do our very best to enforce the law. So that's definitely, a toolkit. I think that's an inspired idea. We hadn't sort of gotten to the point of like exactly what, is most useful to each of the various stakeholders. But yeah, that is firmly on our radar. And one of the things that is so interesting, and I'll just talk about one instance that has been widely sort of reported. I'm not going to name check the company, but if you were to check it out on the internet, I'm sure it would come up. But there was a really interesting instance where actually a tech company was trying to develop a tool of its own to screen applicants and do it efficiently. And perhaps I think one of their goals was to make sure that there wasn't bias. And what they did was to take about, I think, a decade of past resumes of successful applicants and use that as sort of the standard. So in other words, they were building a computer model to predict who would be a successful employee. So they took their past employees. But what happened, because that most of them were men, they ended up with a tool that would systematically downgrade women. And it was doing things like if you had, for instance, on your resume, the word women or women's, right? So say you were the captain of the women's basketball team. Well, that wasn't in any of their largely male resumes that they were using as the model, right? So that was an automatic downgrade. There were also some names of women's colleges. I don't remember which they were, but if you had those women's colleges on your resume, downgrade, right? Nothing to do with qualifications at all. And so they discontinued using it. So no one has to worry on that. But that's the kind of thing we have to worry. And if you worry about, and if you think about it, that's core, right down the heart of what the disparate impact standard is about and some of our core enforcement is. So we do have to be vigilant. One of the things that we think we can be a resource in doing is not only helping support employers knowing what to look for as they select these programs, but also help you all understand what's out there. And so gathering that information gathering. And we're at the stage of thinking forward towards listening sessions to really gather exactly what you're talking about. How are these tools being used? Where do we need to be looking? What's challenging for us, I think in particular, there's two things. One is that, and when I say us, I mean us collectively. One is that most of the time the employee, that's always sort of the case, that the employee doesn't really know what happened, why they were not selected. But here they really don't have visibility into it. And so one of the things that we are really hoping to encourage is some transparency when these programs are used. There may be, for instance, sort of gamified selection systems, right? So it's sort of a program or a selection test that's really in the form of almost like a video game. Sometimes you'll have an applicant who they have a disability, they need additional time or some other kind of accommodation to effectively complete that. Nothing to do with whether they're qualified, they just need that accommodation. So that would be one thing to look for, is if there was some sort of gamified selection system, so that is something that the employee you might have to ask them a few questions to figure out what it was, but that's something that we could identify now as something they would know. But you're absolutely right, it's tricky because a lot of times the folks who may, usually would have sort of a suspicion that they needed to file a charge, they don't have that information. They just know they weren't selected. So that's one of the reasons why we really thought it was important for us to kind of lean in on this.
Thank you. I think we've got other questions, but I think we're out of time. I think we could all agree that we could probably use another hour or so on this panel. You all have been phenomenal. Thank you again, Assistant Secretary McCain, Chair Burrows, and Lisa Rice, CEO of NAFA, for all of your just your passion with which you do the work, the dedication and devotion, and continued success in all that you do. Thank you so much. And I think we're concluding this panel. Thank you.